A quiet farmer walked into a John Deere dealership and calmly said he wanted to buy 15 tractors that same day, and the dealer laughed out loud, convinced the old man didn't even have enough money for one. But within minutes, that laughter would turn into shock, embarrassment, and the biggest sale of the dealer's entire career. It was a cool Thursday morning in April 2012 at Greenfield Tractor Supply in Salina, Kansas, a busy John Deere dealership that had been owned by Mark Dalton since the early 1990s. Mark had built the place into one of the largest equipment dealerships in the county, selling millions of dollars in tractors, combines, and implements every year. He had seen every type of farmer walk through his doors, large operations buying fleets of new equipment, struggling farmers looking for used parts, and hobby farmers trying to buy their first tractor. After 30 years in the business, Mark believed he could size up a customer in the first 5 seconds just by looking at them. Expensive truck outside, clean boots, confident attitude, serious buyer. Rusty pickup, worn jacket, hesitant voice, probably just browsing. That belief was exactly why, when Samuel Turner walked into his office that morning, Mark didn't take him seriously for even a second. Samuel was 72 years old, tall but slightly hunched from decades of farm work, wearing dusty leather boots, faded blue overalls, and a brown canvas jacket that looked like it had seen 20 harvest seasons. His hands were rough and stained with grease, the kind of hands that spent more time fixing machinery than sitting behind a desk. Mark had seen Samuel around town a few times over the years. The man farmed somewhere outside Salina, but he wasn't one of the dealership's major customers. In fact, the only times Mark remembered seeing him before were when Samuel stopped in to buy a small part or a hydraulic hose every couple of years. Nothing about him suggested a large operation or serious money. Samuel stepped into Mark's office, removed his hat politely, and said in a calm voice, "Morning. I need to buy some tractors." Mark nodded, assuming this would be a quick conversation about a single used machine. "Sure," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What are you looking for?" Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "I want to buy 15 John Deere tractors today." Mark stared at him for a moment, waiting for a smile or a hint that the old man was joking. There wasn't one. Samuel stood there patiently, holding the piece of paper. Mark let out a loud laugh, the kind that fills a room and carries a bit of disbelief with it. 15 tractors? Today, he said, shaking his head. "You're serious?" Samuel nodded. "Completely." Mark leaned forward, still smiling. "Do you know what 15 tractors cost?" "Even used ones," Samuel replied calmly. "Depends on the models." Mark turned his computer screen toward himself and began tapping on the keyboard. "Let's say you're buying decent used inventory. Average around $40,000 each. That's $600,000 or more. You're telling me you want to spend over $500,000 today." Samuel didn't react to the number. Instead, he unfolded the piece of paper and placed it on the desk. "These are the ones I need." Mark glanced down at the list. "For John Deere 4440S, 34640S, 34430S, 34230S, and 24020S. Each model had specific production years written beside it. Mark raised an eyebrow. "This is pretty specific." Samuel simply said, "I know what works." Mark checked the dealership inventory system, mostly out of curiosity. To his surprise, the lot actually had 5 tractors that matched Samuel's list: a 1981 4440, a 1979 4440, a 1982 4640, a 1978 4430, and a 1976 4230. He turned back toward the old farmer. "Well, I happen to have 5 of these machines right now," he said. Samuel nodded. "I'll take them." Mark chuckled again. "Hold on. Those 5 alone are over $200,000. Samuel shrugged slightly. "What's the exact price?" Mark pulled up each machine and read the numbers aloud. The 1981 4440 is $41,000. The 1979 4440 is $38,500. The 1982 4640 is $48,000. The 1978 4430 is $36,400. And the 1976 4230 is $40,700. He quickly added them together. "That's $204,600. Mark expected Samuel to hesitate, maybe laugh awkwardly or explain he didn't actually mean today. Instead, The old farmer calmly reached into his jacket again and pulled out a plain green checkbook. "Who should I make the check out to?" he asked. Mark blinked. "You're serious?" "Yes." "You're going to write a check for $200,000 right now?" Samuel nodded once. Mark leaned back in his chair, still convinced the conversation would collapse in a moment. But Samuel began writing. The scratching sound of pen on paper filled the office for several seconds. Then he tore the check from the book and slid it across the desk. Mark picked it up slowly. $204, $600. Signed clearly, Samuel Turner. The check was drawn from Prairie State Bank in Salina. Mark stared at it, unsure whether to laugh again or call security. "I'll need to verify this," he said carefully. Samuel nodded. "Of course." Mark picked up the phone and dialed the bank. When the banker answered, he read the account name and check amount. There was a short pause on the other end of the line. Then the banker said something that made Mark sit up straight in his chair. "Yes, that account is valid," the banker confirmed. "Mr. Turner currently has $2.8 million available. That check will clear without any issue." Mark slowly hung up the phone and looked across the desk at the quiet farmer in dusty boots who had just written a check larger than many people's houses. 10 minutes earlier, he had laughed at the man. Now he realized he was sitting across from someone who could easily afford not just 5 tractors, but all 15. Mark Dalton sat quietly for a moment, staring at the check in his hand. Just 10 minutes earlier he had laughed at the quiet farmer standing across his desk, convinced the man couldn't afford a single tractor. Now the bank had confirmed the check for $204, $600 would clear instantly, and the same farmer had $2.8 million sitting in his account. Mark felt the embarrassment settling in. Samuel Turner noticed the change in his expression and gave a small smile. "People look at you differently once they know what's in your bank account," he said calmly. Mark shook his head in disbelief. "I have to ask," he admitted. "How does someone with millions walk around looking like you?" Samuel chuckled softly. "Because work boots get dirty when you work," he replied. Then he pulled out the chair in front of the desk and sat down. "Since you're about to help me find 10 more tractors, I'll tell you how it happened." Mark leaned forward, listening carefully now. Samuel began his story. "Back in 1980, I was farming about 300 acres outside Salina. I only had one tractor, an old International harvester that I repaired myself. That same year, my neighbor Robert Langley lost his farm. Good farmer, good man. But he had borrowed too much money during the good years. When interest rates shot up and grain prices dropped, the bank foreclosed." Samuel paused before continuing. "I went to the auction when they sold his equipment. Hardest thing I've ever watched. Dozens of people standing around while a family lost everything. At that auction, Samuel bought Robert's John Deere 4434.9, $200, even though the tractor was worth much more. That's when I realized something," Samuel explained. "When farms fail, banks don't care about value. They just want quick cash." Over the next 15 years, Samuel started attending auctions across Kansas. Whenever equipment was being sold off cheaply, he bought it. Always reliable models like 4020S, 4230s, 4430s, and 4440s. By the mid-1990s, he had around 20 tractors sitting in barns on his property. Most people thought he was crazy for collecting so many machines he didn't use. But Samuel had a different plan. In 1996, a young man named Daniel Brooks came to his farm looking for help. Daniel wanted to start farming, but couldn't get a loan for equipment. Samuel sold him one of the tractors for exactly what he had invested in it, with no interest payments over 5 years. Daniel succeeded. Soon another young farmer came asking for help. Then another. Over the next 20 years, Samuel helped more than 30 young farmers start their operations by selling tractors at cost or giving them flexible payment plans. Mark listened carefully, but still had a question. "That's generous," he said. "But that doesn't explain the millions." Samuel nodded. "Because the tractors weren't the real investment," he said. "The land was." While other farmers borrowed money for expensive new equipment, Samuel saved his profits and lived simply. Whenever farmland went up for sale during hard times, foreclosures, retirements, estate sales, he bought it with cash. Between 1983 and 2005, he quietly purchased over 1,600 acres of farmland. Back then, some parcels cost less than $800 per acre. Now the same land was worth 4 or 5 times that amount. By 2012, Samuel owned nearly 1,900 acres total, worth millions. Mark slowly nodded as the picture became clear. Decades of patience, discipline, and smart timing had turned a modest farmer into a multimillionaire. Samuel glanced at the check on the desk again. "That's where the money came from," he said simply. Mark leaned back in his chair, realizing how wrong his first impression had been. But one question still remained. "So why buy 15 tractors today?" Samuel folded his hands on the desk. "Because I'm 72 years old, and I'm selling most of my land this year." Mark raised his eyebrows. "All of it?" "Most of it," Samuel replied. "After taxes, I'll still have several million left." Mark waited, sensing there was more. Samuel looked toward the dealership lot outside the window where rows of tractors sat in the sun. "I'm starting a foundation for young farmers," he explained. "The money will provide equipment with zero-interest loans for people banks won't help." Then he looked back at Mark. "But before that foundation begins, I want to help 15 farmers right now. That's why I'm buying these tractors." Mark stared at the quiet farmer sitting across from him and realized the real surprise wasn't the money in Samuel's bank account. The real surprise was what he planned to do with it. Mark Dalton sat quietly after hearing Samuel's story, the checks still lying on the desk between them. Just an hour earlier, he had laughed at the old farmer in dusty boots who claimed he wanted to buy 15 tractors. Now he understood that the man sitting across from him wasn't just wealthy. He was about to change a lot of lives. Samuel stood up slowly and adjusted his jacket. "I want the 5 tractors you have delivered today," he said calmly. "And I'd like the other 10 sourced within the next couple of weeks." Mark nodded immediately. "I'll find them," he said. Over the next 12 days, Mark tracked down every tractor on Samuel's list from nearby dealerships and auctions. One by one, they were delivered to Samuel's farm outside Salina. That was when Mark saw something else he hadn't expected. The farm itself was large but simple. Old barns, well-maintained fields, and equipment that was clean but far from flashy. Samuel still drove an old pickup truck with rust along the doors, and his house was a modest farmhouse that hadn't been updated in years. Nothing about the place suggested millions of dollars in wealth. But the real purpose of the tractors became clear during the deliveries. One by one, 15 young farmers arrived at the farm. Some were in their 20s, others in their early 30s. Every one of them had the same story. They wanted a farm, but banks refused to finance the equipment they needed to start. Samuel handed over the tractors personally. Some he gave away completely free. Others he sold for exactly what he paid, with zero-interest payments spread over several years. One young farmer stood speechless beside a John Deere 4440 worth nearly $40,000. Another wiped tears from his face after hearing the payment terms Samuel offered. Mark watched these moments quietly, realizing something important. These weren't handouts to lazy people. They were opportunities for hardworking farmers who simply needed a chance. By the end of the second week, all 15 tractors had new owners and new farms to work. Before Mark left that final day, he walked over to Samuel and shook his hand. "I've been selling tractors for 30 years, Mark said, "but I've never seen anything like this." Samuel smiled slightly. "Most people think wealth is about buying things for yourself," he replied. "But the best use of money is helping someone build a future." In the years that followed, Samuel's Turner Farm Opportunity Fund helped many more farmers get started. The foundation continued providing equipment and support long after Samuel slowed down with age. Mark never forgot the day the quiet farmer walked into his dealership asking for 15 John Deeres. The day he laughed, and the day he learned that real wealth isn't about how rich you look. It's about how many people you help succeed.